From 1967 until the withdrawal in 1971, Australian tracker dog teams operated as part of the 1st Australian Task Force in Phuoc Tuy Province. They were small, elite, and devastatingly effective. A typical tracker team consisted of just 5 men, 2 handlers, each with a dog, 1 section commander, 1 visual tracker, usually an Indigenous Australian soldier whose bushcraft skills were second to none, and 1 coverman, armed and alert, protecting the team while they worked. 2 dogs, 5 men. That's all it took to change the calculus of warfare in the jungle. Their role was specific and critical. They weren't guard dogs. They weren't attack dogs. They were trackers trained to follow scent trails through terrain where human senses failed completely. Through humidity so thick you could taste it. Through mud that swallowed boots whole. Through jungles so dense that visibility dropped to 5 meters. They were used for everything that mattered. Following enemy withdrawal trails after contact. Locating hidden ambush positions before Australian patrols walked into them. Recovering missing diggers. Wounded, isolated, or lost. In the endless green, counter-reconnaissance, finding enemy scouts who'd been watching Australian positions. And most importantly, preventing entire platoons from walking into traps. The dogs lived with their handlers, slept beside them in the mud, shared their rations, patrolled in silence, leash held close, moving as one unit through the jungle. The Viet Cong had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. They could vanish after a contact, sweep trails with branches, walk backwards in their sandals, disappear into tunnel networks and bunker systems that Australian infantry could pass within meters of and never see. But none of it mattered once the dogs arrived. The fear wasn't about the dogs themselves. It was about what the dogs made the Australians capable of. For years, the Viet Cong's greatest advantage had been the jungle. It was their home. They knew every trail, every stream, every hiding place. They could move through it like water, unseen and unheard. The bush was the Viet Cong's fortress until the dogs arrived. Captured Viet Cong soldiers, when interrogated, consistently mentioned the tracker dogs. Not with anger, not with defiance, with something closer to dread. One VC fighter, captured after a contact near Long Tan, was asked what his unit feared most. His answer was immediate. The silent Australians with dogs. You cannot trick them. You cannot hide from them. The tactics that worked against American patrols, camouflage, deception, feints, became useless. A dog didn't care if you reversed your sandals. It didn't care if you brushed the trail behind you. It could follow scent through water, through mud, through the densest jungle on Earth. And the Australians who handled them? They moved like ghosts. Quiet, deliberate, patient. By the time the Viet Cong realized a tracker team was behind them, it was already too late. It wasn't fear of the dogs themselves. It was fear of what they represented. An enemy that couldn't be fooled. An enemy that wouldn't give up. An enemy that would follow you, step by step, until you made a mistake. And in the jungle, one mistake was all it took. There's a reason the Australian tracker teams were so effective, and it had everything to do with where they came from. Most Australian diggers who went to Vietnam didn't grow up in cities. They grew up on farms, in the bush, camping, hunting, working with animals. They grew up reading the land, watching the sky for weather, reading animal tracks, understanding how the wind carried sound and scent. They grew up with dogs, not as pets, as working animals. Sheepdogs, cattle dogs, hunting dogs, animals that had a job to do, and men who knew how to read them. One handler, speaking years later, put it simply, "You didn't train a dog by yelling at it. You learned to understand it. You watched. You listened. And when you got it right, the dog trusted you with its life. That cultural background, that deep, intuitive understanding of animals and the land, was something you couldn't teach in a training program. It was in their bones. Australian patrol doctrine reflected that same philosophy. Small units, quiet movement, deliberate, methodical progress. Australians didn't crash through the jungle. They eased through it, one careful step at a time, listening to every sound, watching every shadow. American doctrine, by contrast, emphasized firepower and speed, large unit maneuvers, overwhelming force. When American patrols moved, they moved with purpose and noise. 20, 30, sometimes 50 men, laden with gear, supported by artillery and air power. There's no judgment in that. It was a different philosophy, designed for a different kind of war. But in the jungle, where silence was survival, the Australian approach had a distinct edge. The Viet Cong learned to hear American patrols coming from hundreds of meters away. The jangle of gear, the snap of branches, the low murmur of voices on the radio. But Australian patrols? One American officer, after working with an Australian tracker team during a joint operation, said this, "I swear to God, I turned around and they were just gone." 10 men and 2 dogs vanished into the jungle like smoke. Didn't hear a damn thing. Another American soldier, in a letter home, wrote, "The Aussies have this way of moving. It's like they're part of the jungle. And those dogs, man, those dogs are something else. It's like they can smell fear." The Viet Cong feared the dogs, but they feared the Australians behind them even more. One veteran, a handler named Bill, remembered it this way: "The Yanks had gadgets. We had instincts. They had sensors and night vision scopes. We had a dog and a bloke who knew how to read it. Different approaches. Both worked. But in the jungle, I'll take instinct every time." That wasn't arrogance. It was culture. And it saved lives. The bond between a handler and his dog wasn't sentimental. It wasn't about affection, though affection was certainly there. It was operational. It was survival. A tracker dog and its handler were a single unit. They lived together, slept together, patrolled together. The handler learned every subtle cue the dog gave, every signal, every change in behavior that meant something. A dog couldn't speak. It couldn't tell you there was an ambush ahead, but it could show you, ears tilting forward, just slightly, a sudden stillness in the body, a change in breathing quicker, shallower, a gentle pull on the leash, or the opposite, a reluctance to move forward. Experienced handlers could read those signs in an instant. And those signs saved lives. One handler, a digger named Marcus, described it this way: "My dog's name was Caesar. Black Lab. Best tracker I ever worked with. He had this thing he'd do when he caught a fresh scent. He'd freeze, just for a second, and his ears would go flat. Not back, not forward. Flat. Like he was listening and smelling at the same time. First time he did it, I almost missed it. Second time, I stopped the entire patrol. We found a VC staging area 30 meters ahead. If we'd kept walking, we'd have walked right into it." That bond, that silent communication, couldn't be rushed. It took time, trust, repetition. The dogs were trained at the Royal Australian Air Force Base in Townsville before deployment. The handlers, many of them volunteers, spent months learning to work with their dogs. But the real training happened in Vietnam, on patrol, where every day was life or death. And the dogs? They were soldiers too. They endured the same heat, the same mud, the same exhaustion. They got bitten by leeches. They contracted jungle rot. They went days without proper rest. But they never quit. One thing that's hard for people to understand, looking back, is how the dogs were classified. Officially, they weren't soldiers. They were equipment, military assets. The same classification as a radio or a rifle. That classification had devastating consequences. When the Australian Task Force withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, the dogs were left behind. Quarantine laws at the time meant they couldn't return to Australia. Some were transferred to the South Vietnamese Army, some were euthanized. The handlers had no say in it. Decades later, handlers still choke up talking about it. One veteran, in an interview years after the war, said this: "I left Vietnam with a medal. Caesar didn't get anything. I got to come home. He didn't." That's something I've carried every day since. Another handler, Terry, put it more bluntly: "We left our mates behind. That's what it felt like. Doesn't matter that they were dogs. They saved our lives, and we left them." It's a wound that never fully healed, and it's a reminder that the cost of war isn't always measured in casualties. The tracker dogs weren't just tools. They were members of the team. And for the men who worked with them, the bond was as strong as any they'd formed with their fellow soldiers. That bond, built on trust and survival, is what made the team so effective. And it's what made their loss so painful. The Viet Cong were masters of camouflage and deception. They had to be. Survival depended on it. But the tracker dogs broke that advantage completely. The tactics Australian teams used were simple, methodical, and brutally effective. Silent tracking was the foundation. The handler kept the leash short, the dog working close. The dog's nose would be low, reading the ground, the air, the vegetation. The team moved slowly, painfully slowly by normal patrol standards, but silence was everything. One noise, one mistake, and the enemy would scatter. The dog worked into the wind whenever possible. Scent travels on air currents, and a good handler always positioned the dog to maximize that advantage. When the scent was strong, the dog would show it. A change in pace, increased focus. The handler would signal back to the team: fresh trail, close. Sometimes the dog would detect what trackers called a figure-8 scent pattern, a circular drift that indicated the enemy had stopped, possibly to set an ambush or observe their back trail. The dog would start working in loops, confirming the pattern. Better to stop and assess than to walk into a kill zone. One of the most valuable skills the dogs had was ambush recognition. The Viet Cong would set ambushes along trails they knew Australian patrols used. They'd wait, sometimes for hours, silent and motionless. But they couldn't mask their scent. And when a dog caught the concentrated smell of multiple men lying in wait, it would stop. No barking, no noise. Just a dead stop and a slight turn of the head. That moment, that silent signal saved entire patrols from annihilation. After a contact, when the Viet Cong withdrew into the jungle, the tracker teams would follow. Backtracking enemy routes allowed Australian intelligence to map out enemy movements, supply lines, and base areas, and the dogs could differentiate between a main group and scouts. The scent trail of 10 men moving together smelled different from 2 men moving separately. That distinction allowed Australian commanders to make tactical decisions: pursue the main group, or let them go and focus on securing the area. These tactics weren't flashy. They weren't Hollywood. But they worked. Operation Bribey, the aftermath of Long Tan, Nui Dat protection patrols. Time and again, tracker dogs allowed Australian forces to find, fix, and engage an enemy that had spent years perfecting the art of vanishing. The Viet Cong adapted to many things during the war: new weapons, new tactics, new technology, but they never adapted to the tracker dogs. Because you can't hide from something that doesn't rely on sight or sound. And that terrified them. The psychological impact of the tracker dogs on Viet Cong forces cannot be overstated. This wasn't propaganda. It was documented. Repeatedly. Through captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and intercepted communications. Viet Cong patrol commanders warned their units to avoid areas where Australian tracker teams were known to operate. Not as a suggestion, as a standing order. One captured document, translated by Australian intelligence officers, included this line: Australian dog units represent significant operational threat. Avoid contact. Relocate if detected. That's not the language of an enemy that's confident. That's the language of fear. Some Viet Cong units deliberately altered their patrol routes to stay clear of areas near Nui Dat, the main Australian base. It created gaps in their coverage, gaps that Australian intelligence exploited. The dogs forced the Viet Cong to change how they operated. They couldn't rely on their old tricks anymore. Sweeping trails, reversing footprints, moving through water, all of it was useless. So they adapted in other ways. They moved faster, which made them noisier and easier to detect by other means. They abandoned supply caches earlier than planned. They avoided certain trails entirely, even when those trails were strategically valuable. In short, the mere presence of tracker dogs disrupted enemy operations. But the fear went deeper than tactics. One captured Viet Cong fighter, a man who'd been operating in Phuoc Tuy Province for over 2 years, was asked directly, "What did you fear most?" He didn't hesitate. The Australians with the dogs. We knew where the Americans were. We could hear them. But the Australians, we never heard them. And the dogs always found us. Another prisoner described it this way: "The jungle is our home. We know it better than anyone. But the dogs know it better than us. That is why we fear them." That fear wasn't irrational. It was based on experience. The Viet Cong prioritized targeting tracker dog handlers during engagements. Snipers were specifically instructed to aim for the handler, not the dog. Why? Because killing the handler disrupted the entire team. The dog, without its handler, was lost. The team, without its dog, was blind. It shows you how much they feared those teams. You don't target something unless it's a threat, and you don't prioritize it unless it's a significant threat. One veteran handler, a man named Ron, remembered a contact where his team came under sniper fire. The rounds were aimed directly at him, not the infantry section behind him. "I hit the ground," Ron recalled. "My dog, Brutus, stayed right next to me, like he'd been trained. The rounds were impacting so close I could feel the dirt hitting my face. The coverman got the sniper good shooting from about 40 meters. But after that, I knew. They weren't just shooting at a patrol. They were shooting at me. Specifically." That's psychological warfare in reverse. The Viet Cong weren't just afraid of the dogs. They were desperate to stop them. And desperation, in war, is a kind of power. It meant the Australians were winning that particular fight. There's a comparison worth making here. Not to diminish anyone's contribution, but to understand why the Australian tracker teams were so uniquely effective. American and Australian forces in Vietnam had different approaches to patrolling, shaped by different doctrines, different training, and different military cultures. American patrols were typically larger, 20, 30, even 50 men. They moved with firepower and speed. Radios crackled. Equipment jangled. Artillery support was always on call. When they made contact, they brought overwhelming force to bear. It was effective. It saved American lives. And it suited the way the U.S. military was structured and supplied. But it was loud. Australian patrols, by contrast, were small. 5 to 10 men, sometimes fewer. Minimal gear. Silence was enforced strictly. No talking. No unnecessary noise. Slow and deliberate movement. The goal wasn't to dominate terrain with firepower. It was to find the enemy, observe, report, and engage only when necessary. The Australians moved like hunters, patient, deliberate, watching, and listening. And the tracker dogs fit seamlessly into that philosophy. American soldiers noticed. And they respected it. One U.S. Marine Corps officer, after spending a week embedded with an Australian patrol, wrote this in his after-action report. Australian patrol discipline is remarkable. Noise discipline is absolute. Observed one Australian tracker team follow enemy trail for 6 hours without speaking a single word. Dog and handler operated with hand signals only. Impressive professionalism. Another American officer, in a letter that later became part of military archives, said, requested Australian tracker support for operation in northern Phuoc Tuy. Team arrived with 2 dogs. Followed enemy withdrawal trail through jungle I didn't think was passable. Found enemy cache and staging area. Australians refused credit. Said the dogs did the work. Damn finest soldiers I've worked with. That humility, that refusal to take credit, was part of the Australian character. It wasn't false modesty. It was mateship. The dogs were part of the team. The team succeeded together, or they didn't succeed at all. American commanders repeatedly requested Australian tracker teams for joint operations, and every time, the results were the same. Enemy trails found. Ambushes avoided, caches located, intelligence gathered. The cultural difference wasn't about who was better. It was about what worked in a specific environment. And in the dense, unforgiving jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australian approach, small, silent, patient, with a tracker dog leading the way, worked brilliantly. One American soldier, in a recorded interview decades later, said something that stuck with people. I'd take 100 men and a radio. The Aussies would take 10 men and a dog. And I swear, they'd get further than we would. That's not a criticism of American tactics. It's a recognition of how effective Australian tracker teams were. The Viet Cong feared them for a reason. And the Americans respected them for the same reason. They got results. The Battle of Long Tan, fought on August 18, 1966, is one of the most famous actions in Australian military history. A company of 108 Australian soldiers faced off against a Viet Cong force estimated at over 2,000. Against impossible odds, the Australians held. But this story isn't about Long Tan itself. It's about what happened afterward. When the smoke cleared and the enemy withdrew, the jungle was littered with enemy dead, discarded equipment, and blood trails leading in every direction. The question was, where did they go? That's where the tracker dogs came in. In the days following Long Tan, tracker teams were deployed to follow the enemy's withdrawal routes. The terrain was hellish mud churned up by artillery, shell craters filled with stagnant water, vegetation shredded by machine gun fire. The smell of death hung in the air. But the dogs worked. They followed scent trails through the devastation, leading their handlers deeper into the jungle. They tracked the enemy back toward the rubber plantations and beyond, mapping out the routes the Viet Cong had used to retreat. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow, dangerous, exhausting work. The enemy had left booby traps along the trails. Snipers covered the withdrawal routes. Every step was a calculated risk. But the intelligence gained was invaluable. Australian commanders learned how the Viet Cong moved after a major engagement. They identified staging areas, supply caches, and routes back to communist base areas across the border. One handler, working his dog through a particularly dense section of jungle, found something that changed the entire intelligence picture. A field hospital, hastily abandoned. Bloodied bandages, medical supplies, and documents scattered across the ground. The Viet Cong had suffered far heavier casualties at Long Tan than they'd admitted, and the tracker dogs proved it. That intelligence shaped Australian operations for months afterward. In February 1967, Australian forces launched a series of operations aimed at disrupting Viet Cong activity near the Soi Inge stream. During one of these operations, an Australian patrol made contact with a Viet Cong force, and a fierce firefight erupted. The enemy, as always, withdrew into the jungle. But this time, a tracker team was standing by. Within an hour of the contact ending, the team was on the ground with 2 dogs. The scent was fresh. The trail was clear. The dogs led the team through terrain that should have been impassable. Thick jungle, waist-deep water, vines so dense you had to cut your way through. But the dogs didn't stop. They followed the scent for over 3 kilometers, moving slowly, methodically, with the handler reading every signal. And then, suddenly, the lead dog stopped. Ears forward, body tense. The handler froze. Hand signal back to the team. Possible contact ahead. The visual tracker moved forward, low and silent. 30 meters ahead, he spotted it. A bunker complex, camouflaged so well it was nearly invisible. And inside, Viet Cong forces. Regrouping after the earlier firefight, the tracker team withdrew silently. Called in the position. Artillery did the rest. It was a textbook example of how tracker dogs turned a fleeting contact into actionable intelligence. The Viet Cong couldn't hide. The dogs wouldn't let them. Not every mission was about finding the enemy. Sometimes it was about finding your own. In mid-1968, an Australian patrol operating near Nui Dat lost contact with one of their men during a contact. The jungle was dense, visibility was near zero, and gunfire had scattered the patrol. When the firing stopped and they regrouped, one man was missing. His name was Paul. He'd been hit, they knew that much. But in the chaos, no one knew where he'd gone. The patrol searched. They called out. They swept the area. Nothing. That's when the tracker team was called in. The handler, a digger named Steve, brought his dog to the last known position. The dog, a black Labrador named Sabre, immediately picked up the scent. He moved through the jungle, nose low, tracking Paul's path. The trail led away from the contact area, deeper into the undergrowth. Steve followed, heart pounding, praying they'd find him alive. 15 minutes later, Sabre stopped, looked back at Steve, sat down. That was the signal. Target found. Steve pushed through the last few meters of vegetation, and there he was. Paul was alive, barely conscious, bleeding from a leg wound. He'd crawled into cover and passed out from blood loss. If the dog hadn't found him, he wouldn't have made it through the night. Steve called in the medics. Paul was extracted. He survived. Years later, Paul said this in an interview. "I don't remember much about that day, but I remember waking up and seeing Steve's face. And I remember that dog, Sabre, sitting right there next to me, like he was standing guard. That dog saved my life. That's what the tracker dogs did. They didn't just find the enemy. They brought mates home. There's one more mission worth telling, because it shows just how subtle and how critical the dog's work could be. In late 1969, an Australian patrol was moving through an area known for Viet Cong activity. Intelligence suggested the area was clear, but you never really knew. The tracker dog, a German shepherd named Rex, was leading the patrol. Everything seemed normal. The jungle was quiet. No sounds. No movement. And then Rex stopped. The handler, a man named David, watched him carefully. Rex's ears had gone flat. His breathing had changed. Short, quick breaths. He wasn't moving forward. He wasn't pulling back. He was just still. David raised his fist. The patrol stopped instantly. No one spoke. No one moved. David watched Rex. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then Rex did something unusual. He turned his head to the left, just slightly, and his ears tilted forward. David understood immediately. Scent was coming from the left flank, and it was strong. He signaled to the section commander. The patrol quietly adjusted position, moving away from the trail into cover. 5 minutes later, the visual trackers spotted them. A Viet Cong ambush team, 8 men, positioned along the exact trail the patrol had been walking. They were waiting. Silent. Disciplined. If Rex hadn't stopped, the patrol would have walked right into it. The Australians withdrew without engaging. The intelligence was more valuable than the contact. Later, back at base, David sat with Rex and gave him an extra ration. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy." Rex had just saved 11 lives, and no one outside that patrol would ever know. That was the nature of the tracker dog's work. Quiet, unsung, invisible to history. But for the men who were there, it was everything. War asks for everything, and the tracker dogs gave it. They endured the same hell as the men they served alongside. The heat, the mud, the leeches, the exhaustion that soaked into your bones and never left. But they couldn't understand why. They couldn't process it the way a human could. They just kept working because their handler asked them to. Some dogs were killed in action. Mines, booby traps, sniper fire meant for their handlers. They died the same way soldiers died suddenly, violently, in a jungle that didn't care. And when a dog was killed, it broke something in the handler. One veteran, a man named Jim, lost his dog, a Labrador named Copper, to a mine in late 1970. Jim was 20 meters behind him when it happened. He heard the explosion, felt the blast wave. Copper didn't make a sound. Jim ran forward, knowing what he'd find. Copper was still alive, barely. Jim held him, tried to stop the bleeding, but there was nothing anyone could do. "He looked at me," Jim said, years later, voice breaking. "I swear he looked right at me, like he was trying to say something, and then he was gone." Jim finished his tour, came home, got married, had kids, built a life. But he never forgot Copper, never stopped thinking about that moment. "He was a good dog," Jim said. "Best I ever worked with. He saved lives. He deserved better than that." That pain, that grief, was carried by every handler who lost a dog in Vietnam. But the worst pain came later. When the Australian task force withdrew in 1971, a decision was made. The dogs couldn't return to Australia. Quarantine laws were strict. The risk of disease was considered too high. Some dogs were transferred to the South Vietnamese Army. Some were given to American units. Some were euthanized. The handlers had no choice, no say. They were ordered to leave their dogs behind. For men who'd spent years working with these animals, trusting them, relying on them, loving them, it was unbearable. One handler, Terry, described it like this: "We said goodbye. I held him. I told him he was a good boy. And then I walked away. I didn't look back. Couldn't. If I'd looked back, I don't think I could have left." Another handler, Ron, said, "They gave us medals. They gave us parades. But my dog? He got nothing. I came home. He didn't. That's not right. That'll never be right." For decades, those men carried that guilt, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because they'd left their mates behind. And in Australian military culture, you don't leave your mates. Even if your mate has 4 legs and a tail. It took decades, but eventually, the story of the tracker dogs began to be told. Veterans spoke out. Historians researched. Documentaries were made. Memorials were built. In 2006, a memorial was unveiled at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, dedicated to all the war dogs that served Australia. It was long overdue. At the unveiling, handlers stood quietly, some with tears in their eyes, as the names of the dogs were read aloud. Caesar, Sabre, Rex, Brutus, Copper, Julian, Cassius, Trajan, Marcus, names that had been forgotten, lives that had been overlooked, sacrifices that had never been acknowledged. One handler, standing at the memorial, said this: "It's not about statues. It's not about plaques. It's about remembering. These dogs saved lives. They did their job. They deserve to be remembered." And now, they are. In schools across Australia, children learn about the tracker dogs of Vietnam. In RSL clubs, veterans gather and share stories. In documentaries and books, the truth is told. The Viet Cong feared them. Their handlers loved them. And Australia remembers them. Because the tracker dogs weren't just animals. They weren't just equipment. They were soldiers. They were mates. And they were heroes. The jungle is quiet now. The trails have grown over. The bunkers have collapsed. But the story remains. In the heat and the mud and the fear, when the stakes were life and death, a small group of Australian diggers and their dogs did something extraordinary. They turned the jungle, the Viet Cong's greatest weapon, against them. They moved in silence, worked with patience, and trusted each other completely. And they saved lives. Some of those dogs never came home. Some of those handlers never forgot. But the legacy endures. Today, when Australian soldiers deploy overseas, they still work with military working dogs. The tradition continues. The bond remains. And somewhere, in the memories of men now in their 70s and 80s, there's a black Labrador sitting quietly beside them in the mud, ears forward, nose low, reading a trail no human could ever see. Waiting for the signal, ready to work, loyal to the end. The Viet Cong were right to fear them. Because in the jungle, when everything else failed, the tracker dogs never did. They were the enemy the Viet Cong couldn't hide from. And they were the mates the Australian diggers would never forget.